My name is Audrey. I'm in my mid 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in roles that sit quietly at the intersection of structure and trust, operations, coordination, the kind of work that only becomes visible when something goes wrong. I've never been the loudest voice in the room. I don't dominate meetings. I don't posture. And because of that, people often mistake my calm for passivity, my patience for softness, and my silence for a lack of authority. If you met me at work, you might describe me as dependable, organized, maybe even a little forgettable. I've been called easy to work with more times than I can count, usually by people who didn't realize how much of the system they were standing on was quietly held together by my hands. I've learned that underestimation has a certain sound to it. It's polite, casual, almost friendly. And it rarely announces itself as disrespect until much later. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about winning or humiliating anyone. It's about something subtler and I think more familiar to many of us. What happens when competence is taken for granted, when responsibility is unevenly distributed, and when silence is misread as consent. It's about a project that crossed departmental lines, about collaboration that was promised and quietly withdrawn, and about how accountability can be distorted when narratives are controlled by the wrong people. At the center of the story is a moment that, on the surface, looked like a simple failure, a missed deadline. An email was copied to leadership, a word, incompetent, used carelessly but with precision. What most people didn't see was the sequence of small decisions that led there, or the intention behind them. What they didn't notice was how long the groundwork had been laid, and how closely some of us had been paying attention. I want to be clear. I'm not sharing this to dramatize office politics or to cast anyone as a villain. Real life rarely offers us clean antagonists. Most harm is done by people who believe they're being reasonable, or strategic, or simply protecting themselves. This is a story about emotional justice, not the loud kind, not the kind that ends with applause, but the quiet kind that restores balance without spectacle. Over the next while, I'll walk you through how I was seen, how that perception shaped the role I was assigned without my consent, and how a shift occurred, not outwardly but internally. I'll talk about documentation, timing, and restraint, about choosing not to react when a reaction was expected, and about what happens when you let other people underestimate you all the way to their own conclusions. I'm telling this honestly, without embellishment, because I think many of us have lived some version of it. Maybe you've been there too, watching something unfold, knowing more than you're saying, wondering when silence becomes a decision instead of a habit. As you listen, I want you to ask yourself gently, have you ever been underestimated in a way that changed how you see yourself, even before it changed how others saw you? To them, I was the constant, not the kind that inspires confidence in a dramatic way, more like the background hum of a building that never loses power. I was the person projects seemed to pass through on their way to becoming something else. My name appeared on documents early and disappeared by the time anything shipped. If something ran smoothly, it was assumed it always would. If something faltered, eyes drifted elsewhere, looking for a more visible explanation. In meetings, I was introduced with phrases like, Audrey will help coordinate, or Audrey keeps us on track. No one ever said Audrey owns this. Ownership was reserved for people who spoke faster, louder, with more certainty than curiosity. I learned early that confidence is often confused with authority, and quiet accuracy is mistaken for support. I didn't resent it at first. There's a comfort in being reliable. There's even pride in it. I liked knowing the details others skipped. I liked understanding dependencies, seeing how decisions in one department quietly affected outcomes in another. My work lived in timelines, risk logs, contingency plans, the unglamorous architecture of delivery. And for a long time, that was enough. The way they looked at me was subtle. It was the way conversations continued over my head, even when I had built the framework they were standing on. It was the way my questions were answered later in email threads, after someone else had repeated them. It was the assumption that I would absorb last-minute changes without protest, because I always had. I became, without anyone explicitly saying so, the safe pair of hands, the one you lean on without asking, the one you assume will catch what you drop. And invisibility has a strange side effect. People start to narrate your role for you. In cross-functional work especially, Narratives matter. Who is driving? Who is supporting? Who is blocking? I was almost always placed in the second category, even when the substance of the work suggested otherwise. I watched decks get presented upstream with my timelines rebranded as a collective effort. I listened as leaders praised alignment without ever asking who had done the aligning. Still, I stayed quiet, partly because I believed in the work, partly because I didn't want to be seen as territorial or difficult, and partly because I trusted that consistency would eventually speak for itself. That, in retrospect, was my first misunderstanding. Consistency doesn't speak, it whispers. And in loud rooms, whispers disappear. There was also something else at play, something more personal. I had learned over the years that asserting myself too directly changed how people treated me. Calm professionalism could suddenly be reframed as rigidity. Clarity could be labeled as defensiveness. So I learned to choose my moments carefully, to wait, to document, to let outcomes accumulate. From the outside, it probably looked like acceptance, like comfort in my lane, like a woman who knew her place and was content to stay there. Inside, it felt different. It felt like watching a pattern repeat and choosing to observe it fully before interrupting it. I was paying attention to who took credit and who took cover, to those who asked questions in public and who assigned blame in private, to how deadlines were framed depending on whose reputation was at stake. When the project that would later define this story began, I was brought in early. Not ceremonially, practically. "We'll need you to keep things moving," someone said. And I did. I mapped dependencies across departments. I flagged risks that hadn't yet materialized. I sent follow-ups that no one responded to until the last possible moment. And each time the same quiet assumption followed me. Audrey will handle it. I didn't correct them, not yet. Because before you change a story, you need to understand exactly how it's being told. And at that point, I was still the dependable background figure, the one no one worried about, the one no one thought to watch closely. That perception of me as reliable, useful, invisible would become the foundation of everything that came next. The first cut was so small that if I hadn't already been paying attention, I might have dismissed it entirely. It came in the form of a meeting recap. We had just wrapped a cross-department sync, one of those long, slightly unfocused calls where everyone agrees in principle and avoids specifics. I had facilitated it, taken notes, and stayed late afterward to translate vague commitments into something resembling a plan. That evening, an email went out summarizing the next steps. It wasn't from me. That wasn't unusual. What caught my eye was the language. Tasks I had clearly assigned, after confirming capacity and dependencies, were reframed as pending alignment. Risks I had flagged were described as newly surfaced concerns. And my name appeared exactly once at the bottom, in a list of attendees. No attribution, no acknowledgement, just a gentle rewriting of reality. I remember staring at the screen longer than necessary, trying to decide whether this mattered. On paper, nothing had changed. The work was still the work, the timeline still held. And if I responded, correcting the record, it would seem petty, overly sensitive. I could already hear the unspoken reaction. Why make a big deal out of this? So I didn't. I replied with a neutral thanks, looks good, and went back to my own documentation. But something shifted internally, not anger, not even disappointment. It was more like a mental note being highlighted. The second cut came a week later. We were approaching an early milestone, and one department hadn't delivered their piece. I had followed up twice, both times politely, both times without response. In the next meeting, when the delay surfaced, the explanation was vague: resourcing issues, competing priorities. Then someone glanced at me and said lightly, "We might need tighter coordination here." It wasn't an accusation. It was worse than that. It was a suggestion, soft enough to pass unnoticed, sharp enough to land. No one challenged it. No one asked what had already been done. And I didn't interject. I simply said, "I'll document the updated risk," and moved on. That was the moment I realized how these things work. Accountability doesn't disappear all at once. It migrates, slowly, quietly, from the people who miss commitments to the people who manage consequences. The third cut was almost elegant in its simplicity. An internal chat message, forwarded to me by a colleague who meant well. "Just a heads up," she said. "They're saying the timeline might slip because of ops complexity." Ops complexity. I had built that timeline to accommodate their constraints. I had adjusted it twice at their request. And now the narrative was shifting subtly but decisively toward me. Still, I said nothing. Not because I didn't care, because I did, but because I was starting to understand the pattern. Each small reframing made the next one easier. Each silence made the story more portable. What struck me most wasn't the behavior itself. It was the collective indifference. No one was malicious. No one was scheming in dark corners. They were simply choosing the path of least resistance. And I was it. There's a particular loneliness in realizing that people will let a quiet person absorb blame simply because they can. That your reputation as steady makes you the safest place to redirect discomfort. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't escalate. I didn't even vent. I just started saving things. Emails, chat messages, meeting notes, not obsessively, not emotionally, methodically. I dated everything. I kept my tone consistent. I continued doing my job exactly as before. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, I stopped assuming that good work would automatically be recognized. I stopped believing that silence preserved neutrality. I began to see it for what it was, a choice that others were already using to their advantage. At the time, I didn't know where this was going. I only knew that something had been cut. Small, almost invisible, but deep enough to matter. And unlike the others, I hadn't ignored it. What's dangerous about subtle disrespect isn't the act itself. It's how quickly it becomes familiar. Once the first few cuts went unchallenged, the behavior didn't escalate dramatically. It simply settled in, like furniture no one remembered choosing. But no one questioned once it was there. Comments became slightly more casual. Assumptions are slightly more convenient. And I found myself adjusting, not outwardly, but internally, to accommodate a reality I hadn't agreed to. It showed up in small ways. Deadlines would be discussed without my input, then confirmed with me afterward. Decisions I had explicitly advised against would be made in parallel conversations, then presented to me as fates accomplis. When those decisions created friction, I was looped in to help smooth things over. I told myself this was normal. Cross-functional work is messy, people are busy, not everything is personal. And that was true, but not all of it. What made it harder to name was that the disrespect never arrived alone. It came wrapped in politeness, in praise even. "We couldn't do this without you," someone said, while simultaneously removing me from a planning thread. "You're so detail-oriented," another added, while dismissing a concern that would later cost us weeks. I learned that flattery can coexist with erasure. I also learned how quickly you can become complicit in your own sidelining. Every time I rationalized someone else's behavior, I made it easier for them to continue. Every time I chose not to correct a misrepresentation, I reinforced it. There was one moment in particular that stands out. We were reviewing progress with a senior leader, someone whose perception carried weight. A slide deck was shared, and as it loaded, I realized I was seeing my work reflected back at me through someone else's voice. My framework, my risk assessment, my mitigation plan, all presented as a collective effort, guided by someone who hadn't been in the room when the hard decisions were made. I waited for acknowledgement that didn't come. When questions were asked, they weren't directed at me. They went to the person presenting. And when a concern was raised, one I had already documented and flagged weeks earlier, the response was, "We're just uncovering that now." Just uncovering. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger exactly, but a quiet disbelief. I could have spoken up. I could have corrected the timeline. I could have said calmly this was identified earlier. I didn't. Because in that moment, I understood something else. Speaking up now would sound defensive. It would feel like an interruption. And worse, it would contradict a narrative that had already begun to solidify. So I stayed silent. And in doing so, I felt the weight of normalization settle in. After that, the pattern repeated with less effort. People missed commitments and looked to me for recovery plans. Communication broke down, and I was asked to realign. When pressure mounted, my role expanded, but my authority did not. I told myself I was being strategic, that patience was a form of power, that this phase would pass. But there was a cost. I began to anticipate dismissal before it happened, to soften my language preemptively, to offer solutions before concerns, so I wouldn't be seen as negative. I was managing not just the project, but the emotional comfort of people who had more positional power than I did. And that, I realized, was the trap. Disrespect becomes normalized not because it's invisible, but because it's inconvenient to challenge, especially when you're the only one who seems to notice it, especially when your reputation depends on being easy. What kept me from breaking that pattern wasn't fear, it was timing. I wasn't ready to intervene yet, not because I lacked clarity, but because I was still gathering it. I needed to see how far this would go, how much weight silence could carry, and who would step in, if anyone, before it tipped into something undeniable. They never did, and that told me everything I needed to know. At some point, without a conversation or a decision I was part of, my role became fixed, not on an org chart, not in a job description, but in the collective understanding of who I was supposed to be in relation to everyone else. I was the stabilizer, the one who absorbed friction so others didn't have to, the person you turned to when something slipped, not to ask why, but to ask how we fix this quietly. It was never stated outright. It didn't need to be. Roles like this are assigned through repetition, not instruction. I noticed it when new people joined the project. They took cues from how others interacted with me. Questions that should have come to me went elsewhere. Updates were shared with me last, as if for record keeping rather than input. And when I did speak, the room often moved on before my point had fully landed. I had become reliable in a way that erased authorship. There's a difference between being trusted and being taken for granted. Trust invites you into decisions. Being taken for granted assumes you'll handle the consequences of decisions made without you. I was living in the second category. What made it more complicated was that I was good at this role. I could anticipate gaps, I could rebuild timelines on the fly. I could translate between departments that spoke entirely different operational languages. And because I could do these things, people assumed I always would. No one asked if I should. I remember one planning session where a critical dependency was glossed over. I raised it gently, explaining the downstream impact. The response was a nod, a "we'll figure it out," and then the conversation moved on. 2 weeks later, when that exact risk materialized, the tone shifted. Suddenly there was urgency. Suddenly leadership wanted answers. And suddenly I was asked why this hadn't been escalated sooner. I didn't argue. I pulled up the notes, the emails, the dated risk log entry. I walked through it calmly. There were nods, some surprise, but no apology, no recalibration of roles, just a quiet absorption of information and a return to business. The message was clear. Knowing the truth didn't change the expectation. I was still the one responsible for making it work. That was when I realized the role I'd been assigned wasn't about competence. It was about convenience. I was useful because I didn't make noise, because I didn't demand credit, because I didn't challenge narratives in real time. And in environments like this, usefulness can be mistaken for compliance. I began to see how carefully the system protected itself. When things went well, success was collective. When things faltered, accountability became diffuse, until it wasn't. Then it landed on the person least likely to push back, me. And here's the uncomfortable truth. I had helped build that system. Every time I smoothed things over instead of naming the source of the friction, I reinforced the idea that my role was to absorb, not to influence. Every time I prioritized harmony over accuracy, I made it easier for others to avoid responsibility. I wasn't angry at them, not yet. I was frustrated with myself. Because once you see the role you've been assigned, you have a choice. You can continue to perform it, hoping recognition will eventually follow. Or you can stop performing it and let the consequences surface where they belong. I didn't announce a change. I didn't confront anyone. I simply began to adjust how much of myself I offered without invitation. I stopped filling in gaps that weren't mine. I stopped rephrasing other people's failures as neutral challenges. I continued doing my job, but only the job that was actually mine. And in doing so, I felt something steady take shape. Not defiance, not resentment, clarity. Because roles only hold as long as someone agrees to play them. And for the first time, I was questioning whether the one I'd been given was worth keeping. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. There was no raised voice, no sharp exchange, no moment anyone else would remember. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, alone at my desk, scrolling through an email thread I wasn't supposed to be on. Someone had forwarded it to me by mistake. The subject line was the neutral, status update, something like that. The content was not. It was a side conversation between two departments, discussing the project timeline, specifically discussing how much buffer there was if their deliverable slipped again. One line stopped me cold. Ops can probably absorb it, they always do. There it was, casual, unexamined, not even unkind, just an assumption, stated as fact. I sat back in my chair and felt the last of my uncertainty drain away, not replaced by anger, but by something quieter and more decisive. Until that moment, a part of me had still believed this was a misunderstanding. If I explained myself more clearly, asserted my boundaries more gently, the pattern would correct itself. But you can't correct a pattern people benefit from. That was the day I stopped hoping to be seen differently. And that, paradoxically, was the day I gained control. I didn't respond to the email. I didn't forward it. I didn't confront anyone. I closed the thread and opened my notebook, the leather-bound one I'd been carrying for years, filled with timelines and annotations no one ever asked to see. And I started a new section, not labeled with emotion, not with grievance, just facts. Dates when dependencies were missed, exact wording from emails, screenshots of chat messages, meeting notes where risks were raised and deferred. I wasn't collecting ammunition, I was building a record. There's a difference. That afternoon, I also did something else. I reread my job description, slowly, carefully. I highlighted what I was actually responsible for, and, just as importantly, what I wasn't. I compared it to what I had been doing. The gap was significant. I realized how much unpaid, unrecognized labor I had been offering in the name of professionalism. How often I had stepped beyond my scope to protect timelines that weren't mine to own. And how that overextension had made it easier for others to step back. The shift wasn't about pulling away, it was about realignment. From that day forward, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reactive, something I defaulted to in order to keep things smooth. Now it has become intentional. I spoke when it mattered. I documented when it didn't. I let questions hang if they weren't directed at me. I stopped answering for other people. And almost immediately, the atmosphere changed. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone could point to. But there was a subtle confusion when I didn't fill a pause. A slight tension when an issue remained unresolved because I hadn't volunteered to resolve it. I watched carefully, not with satisfaction, with curiosity. Because the moment you stop performing an invisible role, people begin to notice the space it occupied. And they don't always like what they find there. That Tuesday afternoon didn't feel important at the time. It felt quiet, administrative even. But it marked the moment when I stopped internalizing other people's assumptions and started working from my own clarity. I didn't know where it would lead. I only knew that I was done being the buffer. And once you make that decision, there's no going back to not seeing what you've seen. After that Tuesday, nothing about my demeanor changed on the surface. I was still calm, still responsive, still professional. If anything, I became more measured, more precise. But internally, the function of my silence had shifted. Before, silence had been a reflex. Now, it was a filter. I stopped filling in blanks that weren't assigned to me. When a question was asked broadly, "Can someone take this?" I waited. When assumptions were made, "This should be fine," I asked what that was based on. Not defensively, just clearly. And when no answer came, I let that absence exist. People are uncomfortable with silence when they expect it to be filled. At first, they mistook my restraint for distraction, then for disengagement. A few even checked in, casually, to ask if everything was okay. I said yes, because it was. For the first time in a while, it truly was. The project continued to move, but differently. Tasks that had once landed on my plate by default now hovered in shared spaces, unresolved longer than usual. I watched as people began to notice dependencies they'd previously ignored. Meetings ran over, follow-ups increased, and quietly the narrative began to strain. What they didn't realize was that I was still working, just not compensating. I was tracking what I owned, delivering it cleanly, and documenting everything else. My calendar was no longer a patchwork of other people's emergencies. My notes grew more detailed, more neutral. I was building something invisible again, but this time, it wasn't a system, it was a boundary. There was a moment during a review when someone said, half joking, "We're all spoiled by how smoothly this usually goes." The laughter was polite, a little tight. I smiled and said nothing, because I knew what usually meant. Silence, when chosen, has a weight people don't expect. It forces clarity. It reveals gaps, and it removes the safety net others didn't know they were relying on. I also noticed something else. The people who benefited most from my previous overextension were the least curious about my change in behavior. They assumed things would correct themselves, that I would step in, as I always had. They mistook consistency for inevitability. I didn't correct them. Instead, I prepared, not in a dramatic way, in a disciplined one. I continued capturing timelines. I saved versions of documents as they evolved. I noted when deadlines were set, who agreed to them, and how they were later reframed. I also began to pay attention to tone, not just what was said, but how. Who used passive language when things slipped? Who escalated preemptively? Who stayed silent when accountability came up? This wasn't about catching anyone out. It was about understanding the system I was operating in. And here's the thing about systems. Once you see them clearly, you don't need to fight them. You just need to stop propping them up. By the time anyone realized my silence was intentional, it was already doing its work. Issues were surfacing closer to their source. Questions were being asked in rooms I wasn't in, and the pressure that had once been quietly redirected toward me was beginning to redistribute. Still, no one confronted me. No one accused me of disengaging. Because on paper, I was doing exactly what was expected. No more, no less. That's the power of quiet dominance. It doesn't announce itself. It simply removes the illusion that someone else is holding the structure together. And when that illusion collapses, people start looking for explanations. They just weren't looking at me. While the surface of the project showed mild friction, missed handoffs, longer meetings, a creeping sense of unease, something else was happening underneath it all. Something no one was watching closely, because no one had ever thought they needed to. I was preparing. Not in secretive ways, not with whispered conversations or dramatic moves. I prepared the way you do when you understand that clarity, not confrontation, is what actually changes outcomes. They never noticed because preparation looks boring from the outside. It looked like me continuing to take notes, like maintaining shared trackers, like calmly asking for confirmations in writing. It looked like follow-up emails that ended with, "Please confirm by EOD so I can update the record." It looked like version histories were saved with dates and names instead of overwritten files. It looked like consistency. What they didn't realize was that I had shifted from managing forward to recording backward. Every decision now had a lineage. Every delay had a timestamp. Every reframe had an origin. I wasn't just tracking what was happening. I was preserving how it came to be explained. And that distinction matters. There's a moment in any troubled project where memory becomes flexible, where people stop saying, "I missed this," and start saying, "We didn't realize," or "It wasn't clear." I was making sure those moments had context. I also started paying closer attention to dependencies outside my scope, not to fix them, but to understand how often they were ignored until they landed somewhere safe. Patterns emerged quickly once I stopped interrupting them. One department consistently delayed approvals until pressure mounted. Another routinely committed in meetings and renegotiated privately afterward. And one, in particular, had a habit of going quiet just long enough for timelines to slide, then resurfacing with concern and urgency, as if the delay had appeared out of nowhere. They assumed I wasn't watching. Why would they? I had always been the one smoothing things over, not spotlighting them. I also began organizing my documentation differently. Instead of grouping notes by meeting, I grouped them by decision. Instead of tracking tasks by owner alone, I tracked them by dependency. It created a narrative that didn't rely on interpretation, just sequence. At the same time, I was careful about my tone. Nothing emotional, nothing accusatory, everything factual. If someone missed a deadline, I noted the date it was agreed upon, the follow-up sent, and the response, if there was one. If priorities shifted, I recorded when and how that shift was communicated. No commentary, no conclusions. The irony is that this kind of preparation often goes unnoticed precisely because it doesn't disrupt anything. at first. It doesn't challenge authority. It doesn't demand attention. It just quietly accumulates truth. And truth, when it's organized, becomes leverage. I didn't share my records. I didn't hint at them. I continued to be polite, cooperative, and focused on my actual responsibilities. I let others continue believing that the project's fragility was being quietly managed somewhere in the background. What they never noticed was that the background had changed. I was no longer absorbing uncertainty, I was mapping it. I was no longer translating failures into neutral language. I was preserving the original words. And most importantly, I had stopped assuming that my role was to protect everyone from consequences. My role, as I now understood it, was to make reality visible when the time came. I didn't know exactly when that would be, but I could feel the system tightening, deadlines were approaching, leadership attention was increasing, and narratives were beginning to solidify again, this time under pressure. They thought they still had time. I knew they didn't. The reveal didn't come from another person. It came from my own review. One evening, after most of the office had gone quiet, I sat with the full set of records spread across my screen. Not just recent weeks, months, emails, chat threads, meeting notes, version histories. I wasn't looking for a smoking gun. I was looking for coherence. And I found it. The missed deadlines weren't random. They clustered around one dependency, one department that had been involved from the start, but never quite on the hook publicly. They agreed early, delayed quietly, and re-entered conversations only when timelines were already compromised. Each time, the language shifted just enough to suggest confusion rather than choice. But the timestamps told a different story. They hadn't been confused. They had been calculating. What became clear, line by line, was that one critical milestone had been missed deliberately. Not in a way that could be easily accused or proven without context, but in a way that created plausible deniability. They had gone silent during the window when action mattered most. And then, once the deadline passed, they reappeared with concern and an email, carefully worded, widely copied. Leadership was CCD. The message framed the delay as a discovery, a realization that something downstream, something operational, was more complex than expected. And in doing so, it subtly positioned my team as the bottleneck. I read that email 3 times. Not with anger, with clarity. Because when I overlaid it with my records, the sequence was undeniable. The complexity had been raised earlier, multiple times. The deadline had been confirmed. The silence had been strategic. They had missed it on purpose. And then they had named us incompetent without ever using the word. This was the private reveal. Not something I shared, not something I confronted. Just a moment of internal alignment where doubt fell away completely. Up until then, I had still allowed for the possibility of misalignment, of overload, of good intentions gone wrong. That evening, I stopped doing that. Not because I became cynical, but because the evidence no longer supported generosity. And with that came a surprising sense of calm. I didn't feel the urge to act immediately. I didn't feel wronged in a way that demanded a response. What I felt was grounded, certain. The kind of certainty that doesn't rush. Because once you see intent clearly, you don't need to prove it emotionally. You just need to decide how much of it you're willing to tolerate. I asked myself a few quiet questions. If I escalated now, what would happen? There would be meetings, explanations, apologies perhaps. And then the system would adjust just enough to continue functioning the same way. If I stayed silent, what would happen? The narrative would likely harden, pressure would increase, and eventually someone would be blamed. The question wasn't if something would break, it was where. And that's when I understood the leverage I had. Not because I controlled outcomes, but because I controlled accuracy. I had a complete neutral record that showed not just what happened, but when, how, and who knew what at each stage. That kind of leverage doesn't shout, it waits. I closed my laptop that night without sending a single message. No notes to self, no draft emails. Just the quiet knowledge that I no longer needed to guess what was going on. The story was already written. The only decision left was when and whether I would let others read it. Clarity changes the shape of your options. Once I understood that the missed deadline had been intentional and that leadership had been brought in to solidify a version of events that favored them, I stopped thinking in terms of reaction. I started thinking in terms of outcomes. I gave myself time, not days, weeks. I watched how the narrative evolved without my intervention, how concern turned into urgency, how urgency began to look for a place to land. And as expected, it drifted toward me. Questions started arriving with a different tone, less collaborative, more evaluative, requests for status that were really requests for reassurance. I responded to each one with the same calm precision I always had. Facts, dates, scope, no defensiveness, no speculation. Inside, I was weighing three paths. The first was to escalate immediately, to request a meeting, present my documentation, and correct the narrative before it calcifies further. It was the cleanest option on paper. It would likely resolve the immediate issue and protect my reputation. It would also reset the system back to its baseline. The second option was to disengage, to pull back, do only the minimum, and let the project struggle visibly. That would force accountability, but it would also harm people who had nothing to do with the decision. And it would undermine work I still cared about. I ruled that out quickly. The third option was quieter, more patient, and irreversible. It involved letting the deadline fail exactly where it was always going to fail, without intervention, without rescue, and without editorializing. It meant allowing leadership to see the consequences of the missed commitment in real time, rather than as a retrospective explanation. And when the moment came, it meant presenting the full record, not as an accusation, but as a reference. This option required restraint. It required me to tolerate discomfort, to let my name hover in ambiguity a little longer. It also required absolute confidence in my documentation and in my ability to remain composed when the pressure peaked. I chose the third option, not because it was the most dramatic, but because it was the most honest. I didn't announce this decision to anyone. I didn't change my behavior outwardly. I continued to deliver what I owned. I continued to respond promptly. I continued to track dependencies that were outside my control without compensating for them. As the deadline approached, the tension increased. Reminders went out, follow-ups became more frequent, and still, the department in question remained quiet. Then, just as before, they resurfaced, this time with a familiar message: concerned, regretful, widely CC'd. Leadership was included again. The implication was the same. Something operational had blocked progress, something unforeseen, something that suggested a lack of readiness. I read the message once, then again, and I did nothing. I didn't correct it. I didn't respond immediately. I let it sit, unanswered, for exactly as long as my role allowed. Long enough for others to read it, long enough for assumptions to form. And then, when asked directly for an update, I replied with a single line: I can walk through the documented timeline if that would be helpful. No emotion, no defense, just an offer. That was the moment the decision became visible. Not to them, but to me. Because once you choose not to rescue a narrative that harms you, you force it to confront reality on its own terms. And reality, when it arrives without cushioning, has a way of clarifying things very quickly. Once the decision was made, the hardest part wasn't action. It was a restraint. From the outside, it looked like nothing was happening. The same meetings continued, the same dashboards were reviewed, the same polite language circulated in emails. But beneath that surface, I had shifted fully into execution mode, quiet, precise, and deliberately narrow. I stopped anticipating problems that weren't formally assigned to me. If a dependency hadn't been delivered, I noted it in the tracker and moved on. If a decision was deferred, I documented the deferral and its impact. I didn't chase. I didn't go beyond what protocol required. I didn't translate silence into reassurance. This wasn't disengagement, it was alignment. I was operating exactly within my role, exactly within scope, exactly within policy. That's what made it invisible. No one can accuse you of non-cooperation when you are doing precisely what you said you would do. And nothing you didn't. The department that had missed the deadline began to feel the pressure, not from me, but from the system itself. Leadership asked questions. Stakeholders wanted clarity. And for the first time, those questions weren't being redirected toward me for smoothing. They were landing where the gap actually was. Still, there was no open conflict, no confrontation, just a growing unease. I could sense it in the way meetings started to include more people. In the meantime, follow-ups became more formal, in the way language tightened. What mattered most during this phase was discipline. I didn't editorialize. I didn't say, as I mentioned before. I didn't point out patterns or remind anyone of past warnings. I let the record speak when asked and stayed silent when I wasn't. I also prepared for scrutiny. I reviewed every artifact I might be asked to share. I checked dates, I ensured consistency, I removed anything that could be interpreted as emotional or speculative. What remained was clean, factual, and complete. This kind of preparation is unglamorous. It doesn't feel powerful in the moment, but it creates a position that can't be shaken when attention finally arrives. And attention did arrive. Leadership requested a deeper review. Not accusatory, curious. They wanted to understand how a project that had looked stable for so long had suddenly reached a critical delay. I was invited to that conversation, not as a problem to be solved, but as a source of information. That distinction mattered. I didn't volunteer conclusions. I walked through the timeline when asked. I answered questions directly. When something fell outside my scope, I said so. When something had been flagged earlier, I showed where. No emphasis, no gotcha moments. Just sequence. I could feel the shift in the room, not toward vindication, but toward recalibration. The story people had been telling themselves was no longer holding together, and still I didn't rush ahead. Because moving in silence isn't about disappearing. It's about arriving prepared, without having announced your approach. By the end of that phase, no one had apologized. No one had been blamed publicly. But something fundamental had changed. Responsibility was no longer assumed, it was being examined. And once examination begins, consequences aren't far behind. Consequences rarely announce themselves as punishment. They arrive as adjustments. After the review with leadership, there was no dramatic fallout, no tense emails, no sudden reassignments. What followed instead was a quiet reordering of attention. Meetings changed shape. Invitations shifted. Questions that once came to me as afterthoughts now arrived early, with context. Dependencies were named explicitly instead of assumed. And the department that had gone silent before deadlines was suddenly very present, not defensive, alert. I noticed it first in the trackers. Tasks that had floated without owners were now assigned clearly. Deadlines were negotiated instead of declared. Language tightened. "We'll try" became "we can deliver by." These changes didn't come from me. They came from scrutiny. Leadership hadn't accused anyone. They didn't need to. Once they saw the full sequence, once it was clear that delays had a shape and a source, the system began correcting itself. And correction feels like a loss to the people who benefited from the old arrangement. The department that had missed the deadline began to lose flexibility. Their requests were met with follow-up questions. Their timelines were cross-checked. Their communications were forwarded instead of summarized. Nothing cruel, nothing public, just accountability. I also noticed a subtle shift in how I was addressed. Not warmer, not more deferential, just more precise. People stopped assuming. They asked. They waited for answers before moving on. It wasn't validation, it was recalibration. There was one moment that stayed with me. In a meeting, someone from that department started to reframe a missed deliverable as a shared challenge. It was an old habit, familiar language, the kind that had worked before. This time a leader asked, "Can we pause and clarify where that dependency sat?" The question was calm, neutral, but it stopped the conversation cold. I didn't say a word, I didn't need to. The consequences weren't loud, they were cumulative. Each small moment of clarity narrowed the space where narratives could be bent. Each request for specificity removed another layer of ambiguity. I could tell the pressure was building, not on me, but around me. And with pressure came discomfort. People reached out more often, some to align, some to explain, some to preempt. I listened, I acknowledged, I didn't absorb. That distinction mattered. I wasn't interested in being seen as right. I was interested in being accurate. And accuracy, once established, does its own work. What surprised me most was how quickly things stabilized once accountability shifted. Timelines became realistic. Risks were surfaced earlier. The project regained momentum, not because anyone was working harder, but because fewer things were being hidden. And in that stabilization, I felt something else settle. Relief. Not triumph, not satisfied. Just the easing of a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for so long. The weight of compensating, of protecting, of translating. The consequences were underway, and I was no longer at the center of them, which is exactly where I belonged. By the time panic surfaced, the window for quiet correction had already closed. It didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through tone, through urgency that no longer sounded procedural. through emails sent late in the evening, asking for quick syncs and alignment on things that should have been settled weeks earlier. The department that had once relied on ambiguity began reaching out directly. Not formally, not in writing. Informal messages, calls that went to voicemail, invitations framed as collaboration but carrying a different weight. They were trying to reinsert flexibility into a system that had already hardened. I responded to everything appropriately, professionally, in writing. When asked for help, unblocking that, I asked what specifically was blocked and by whom. When asked to reframe updates for leadership, I asked what needed clarification. When asked to jump on a call to clear the air, I suggested an agenda. Each time the momentum slowed, because what they needed wasn't clarity, it was cover. And cover only works when someone agrees to provide it. The realization that it was too late came during a leadership update. The timeline was reviewed again, this time with questions attached. Not accusations, but precise inquiries about commitments, confirmations, and follow-through. The kind of questions that can't be answered with generalities. The department struggled, not because they were incompetent, but because their usual strategies no longer applied. There was no buffer, no one smoothing language, no one is absorbing delay. They attempted to explain, to contextualize, to reframe, but the record was already there. I watched quietly as their explanations circled around the same gaps. Gaps that had once been invisible because someone else had been managing them. The room didn't turn hostile, it turned quiet. And in that quiet, the truth settled. Afterward, there were attempts to recover. Apologies that came late and landed sideways. Offers to reset and move forward together. Language that suggested mutual responsibility without naming specifics. It didn't work. Because once leadership sees a pattern clearly, you can't unsee it. And once a narrative loses credibility, no amount of urgency can restore it. I wasn't asked to defend myself. I wasn't asked to explain my silence. I wasn't asked to justify my documentation. The questions had moved past me. That was the moment I understood something important. Resolution doesn't always involve acknowledgement. Sometimes it simply involves the removal of doubt, and doubt had been removed. The project moved on with revised expectations, revised oversight, and revised roles. The department's influence narrowed. Their timelines were no longer assumed, they were verified. Nothing dramatic, nothing humiliating. Just a system correcting itself too late for them to preserve their old position. As for me, I remained exactly where I was. No promotion, no praise, no public recognition. But something far more valuable had been restored. Credibility. And once credibility is established quietly, it doesn't need defending, it just exists. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointingly ordinary. No raised voices, no dramatic reveals. Just a meeting request with a clear agenda and a limited guest list. I was included, not as an afterthought, but as context. We sat in a small conference room, 3 of us from different sides of the project. The air wasn't tense, it was careful. The department lead spoke first, calmly, measured. They acknowledged that the missed deadline had caused a downstream impact. They used language like miscommunication and shared assumptions. It was an attempt to soften the edges without denying the facts. I listened. When it was my turn, I didn't counter their framing. I didn't correct their language. I simply added detail. I walked through the timeline, slowly. I pointed to dates when deliverables were confirmed, to messages where risks were raised and deferred, to the period of silence before the deadline passed. I didn't say you chose this. I said this is when the decision window closed. That distinction mattered. There was a pause after I finished, not awkward, reflective. The leader facilitating the meeting asked one question. Was there an opportunity to surface this earlier? I answered honestly. It was surfaced several times. No emphasis, no edge. The department lead nodded, not defensively, with recognition. They didn't argue, they didn't justify, they didn't apologize either, not directly. But something shifted. The conversation moved from explanation to adjustment, from narrative to logistics. Roles were clarified, expectations were set, oversight was named, and then the meeting ended. That was it. No catharsis, no vindication speech, no emotional release, just alignment. Afterward, the department lead stopped me in the hallway. They said, "I didn't realize how much you were tracking." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't gratitude. It was an acknowledgement. I said, "It's part of my role." And that was true. just not in the way they had previously understood. The heat people expect from confrontation comes from emotion-seeking validation. I didn't need validation. I needed the system to reflect reality, and it did. Walking back to my desk, I felt lighter, not because I had won, but because I hadn't compromised myself to get there. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't been sharp or sarcastic. I hadn't humiliated anyone. I had simply stayed accurate long enough for the truth to arrive on its own. That kind of confrontation doesn't leave scorch marks. It leaves clarity. And clarity, once established, doesn't need to be enforced. After everything settled, there was no sudden transformation on the outside. My title didn't change. My workload didn't dramatically shrink. People didn't start treating me like a different person. And that strangely was the point. What changed was internal. I no longer carried the quiet anxiety of being misread. I no longer preemptively softened my clarity. I no longer felt responsible for maintaining narratives that weren't true. The role I occupy now is the same on paper, but it's different in practice. I'm invited earlier, asked directly, consulted instead of assumed. Not because I demanded it, but because the system adjusted around accuracy instead of convenience. And I adjusted too. I speak less, but with more intention. I document without resentment. I let gaps remain visible. I no longer confuse being helpful with being indispensable. There's a calm that comes from knowing you don't need to overextend to be effective. I also let go of something else, the need to be liked in the abstract. I still care about relationships. I still value collaboration. But I no longer trade clarity for comfort. If that makes me seem less easy, I accept it. What surprised me most was the absence of bitterness. I don't replay the moments of dismissal. I don't rehearse what I should have said. I don't fantasize about outcomes that didn't happen. The story resolved itself without requiring me to harden. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about self-alignment, about acting in a way that's consistent with your values, even when it's inconvenient. I didn't change who I was to be taken seriously. I stopped distorting myself to fit an expectation that was never fair to begin with. And that shift, subtle, internal, steady, is the one that lasts. There's a certain kind of ending we're taught to look for in stories like this. A moment of triumph, a clear villain exposed, an apology delivered at the right time in front of the right people. But real life doesn't often give us that kind of symmetry. And if I'm honest, I don't think it's the ending that matters most. What matters is what you carry forward. The moral of the story isn't that silence is always powerful. It's that intentional silence is different from avoidance. One is a reflex born of fear or habit. The other is a choice grounded in clarity. I didn't win by outmaneuvering anyone. I didn't protect myself by becoming louder or sharper or harder to work with. I protected myself by becoming accurate, by understanding my role precisely, by documenting reality without emotion, by letting consequences surface where they belonged instead of absorbing them quietly. That's not revenge. That's alignment. There's also a lesson here about competence and perception. Being reliable can make you invisible if you're not careful. Not because reliability is a flaw, but because some systems are built to lean on the quietest support until it collapses. The work doesn't change that system. Awareness does. And awareness begins internally. I didn't need the department to admit what they did. I didn't need leadership to praise me. I didn't need my name attached to every success. What I needed was to stop participating in a pattern that cost me integrity. Once I did that, everything else followed naturally. If you're listening to this and recognizing parts of yourself in it, if you've been the one smoothing things over, filling gaps, protecting outcomes at your own expense, I hope this story offers something gentler than advice. Permission. Permission to pause, to observe, to document, to let silence become a choice instead of a burden, to trust that accuracy, patiently held, has its own gravity. And before we end, I want to leave you with one question, something to reflect on, or share if it resonates. Where in your life are you being relied on? Not because you're empowered, but because you're quiet. And what might change if you stopped carrying what was never yours to hold?